The rain fell softly over the ancient stone walls of the royal estate, as if even the heavens were cautious not to disturb what was unfolding behind closed doors. Inside the palace, however, calm was nothing more than an illusion. Beneath the polished marble floors and gilded chandeliers, tension had taken root, silent, sharp, and growing stronger with every passing hour. It began, as many palace storms do, not with a declaration, but with a whisper about old privileges, about forgotten arrangements, about items once believed to be permanently settled within the royal vault of tradition. And at the center of it all, as the whispers grew louder and more tangled, stood Camilla, whose recent movements had not gone unnoticed. For weeks, subtle shifts had been observed within royal administrative circles, requests made, documents revisited, inventory lists quietly cross-checked. At first it seemed routine, the kind of procedural housekeeping no one questioned. But then came the unusual inquiries, questions about a particular estate that had long been considered outside of personal claim. And even more controversially, mention of a tiara whose history was bound tightly to legacy, lineage, and delicate agreements made decades earlier. Those who served within the palace understood one rule above all: nothing is ever just paperwork, and Prince Edward knew it better than most. Unlike others who allowed emotion to cloud judgment, Edward had spent years learning the quiet machinery of royal structure. The way influence moved, not through declarations, but through patience, timing, and precision. He did not react quickly. He observed. He collected. Waited for the moment when truth would reveal itself without needing to be forced. That moment, according to those closest to him, had now arrived. It was said that the first real rupture occurred during a closed-door meeting held deep within the private wing of the estate. Only a handful of senior advisors were present, and the atmosphere was described as unusually still, like the calm before a ceremonial bell tolls in warning. Camilla's representatives had entered the discussion with confidence. There were references to historical entitlement, restoration of rightful association, and symbolic correction of past oversights. On paper, the language sounded diplomatic, but beneath it lay a far more ambitious intent, an attempt, as some insiders later whispered, to reassert claims over assets long believed to have been permanently reassigned within the royal framework. Among those assets were references to a country estate steeped in heritage and a tiara whose value was not measured merely in jewels, but in what it represented: continuity, recognition, and quiet authority within royal tradition. But Prince Edward was not persuaded. He listened without interruption. He did not raise his voice. He did not interrupt the flow of carefully constructed arguments. Instead, observed every phrase, every pause, every carefully chosen word that revealed more than it concealed. When the presentation ended, silence filled the room. It lingered longer than anyone expected. Then Edward spoke, not with anger, not with accusation, but with clarity so precise it unsettled even the most seasoned advisors present. He began by revisiting the original agreements, documents archived, but never invalidated. He referenced dates, he referenced approvals, he referenced structural decisions made under the authority of senior royal governance that, according to established protocol, remained binding unless formally revoked. There was a shift in the room, subtle but unmistakable. The confidence that had entered with Camilla's representatives began to fracture. Edward continued, gently but firmly outlining inconsistencies between what was being requested and what had been historically documented. He did not accuse anyone directly. He did not need to. The records spoke for themselves. By the end of the meeting, no resolution had been reached. But something more important had occurred. The narrative had changed direction. What had been presented as a simple restoration request was now under scrutiny as a potential overreach into territories long considered settled. And Edward was only getting started. Within hours, internal correspondence began circulating among senior royal offices. Questions were raised not only about the estate and tiara in question, but also about how and why such claims were being revived at this particular moment in time. Timing in royal affairs is never accidental. It is studied. It is deliberate. And it often reveals intent more clearly than words ever could. Behind closed doors, advisors debated quietly. Some suggested misunderstanding. Others saw something more strategic, an attempt to reframe historical boundaries while attention elsewhere was divided. But Prince Edward remained composed. He instructed his team not to escalate, but to document every request, every communication, every deviation from established protocol. It was not a move of aggression. It was a move of preparation, because in his mind, this was no longer about misunderstanding. It was about exposure. Meanwhile, Camilla's circle maintained a firm stance publicly, insisting that all actions were within traditional allowances and carried no intent of disruption. Yet within the palace, perception was shifting. And in that environment, perception often becomes reality long before official statements are made. Estate at the center of it all, an elegant property with centuries of layered history, became more than just land. It became a symbol. And symbols within royal life carry weight far beyond their physical presence. They represent balance. They represent continuity. And when contested, expose fault lines that were never meant to be visible. As days passed, Prince Edward began assembling what insiders later described as a timeline of clarity, not a weapon, not a retaliation, but a structured record intended to remove ambiguity from a situation increasingly clouded by interpretation. It included archived correspondence, signed approvals, historical transfers, and most importantly, confirmations that certain items and properties had been reassigned under conditions that were never intended to be reversible without unanimous agreement from senior authority. The deeper he went, the more intricate the pattern became. Not of wrongdoing, but of misalignment between memory and record, between assumption and documentation. Still, the tension did not ease. If anything, it intensified, because once a claim is questioned within royal walls, it rarely fades quietly. Either collapses under its own weight or escalates into something far more public than anyone intended. And as Prince Edward reviewed the final document of the evening, placing it carefully into the sealed file marked for restricted review, one truth became unmistakably clear. This was no longer a private misunderstanding. It was the beginning of a reckoning shaped not by anger, but by precision. Outside, the rain continued to fall over the estate, washing over stone paths and garden hedges untouched by time. But inside, behind heavy doors and guarded corridors, something far less visible was unfolding. A shift in control. A quiet reversal. A carefully measured response that would soon make silence impossible to maintain. By the following morning, the palace no longer felt like a place of quiet order. It felt like a structure holding its breath. Prince Edward's compiled file had moved beyond his private office and into the hands of a select group of senior constitutional advisors. Not as an accusation, but as a clarification exercise. Yet everyone understood what it truly meant. Once documentation of that level enters circulation, it begins to shape decisions far beyond the room it was created in. Camilla's representatives were the first to request a formal response. They did not receive one immediately. Instead, they received something far more unsettling. Silence backed by procedure. And within royal systems, procedure is never passive. It is deliberate, structured, and often more powerful than any spoken rebuttal. By midday, informal discussions had begun to shift tone. What had once been framed as a restoration request was now being described in internal language as a re-evaluation of prior assumptions. That subtle change in wording signaled everything. It meant the palace was no longer treating the matter as routine. Prince Edward did not celebrate. He did not escalate. He simply ensured that every document remained accessible, every timeline intact, every inconsistency clearly indexed. Then came the turning point. A confidential review concluded that certain historical claims tied to the estate and Tiara lacked the procedural authorization required for revival, not necessarily invalid in sentiment, but unsupported in governance. Royal terms, that distinction is decisive. The implication was clear. The attempt to reassert control over the estate and Tiara could not proceed. Just like that, the momentum shifted completely. By evening, the atmosphere within the palace corridors had changed again. This time, not with tension, but with acceptance. Advisors adjusted their language. Meetings were rescheduled. Conversations softened into careful neutrality. Camilla's circle, once confident in quiet correction, now faced a wall built not of emotion, but of structure. And at the center of it all stood Prince Edward, whose approach had never been about confrontation, but containment. Not revenge in the dramatic sense, but resolution through precision. As the sun set over the estate, the matter was quietly marked for closure review. No public statements followed. No dramatic announcements were made. But within the palace, everyone understood what had happened. A claim had been tested. A boundary had been challenged. And in the end, it was not force that decided the outcome, but record, timing, and institutional memory. Prince Edward had not needed to shout. He had simply allowed the system to speak for him, and it had spoken clearly.